August 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal. Dawn broke over the Solomon Sea with a silence that felt unnatural. Beneath the rising mist, the dark outline of American landing craft crept toward a nameless stretch of jungle. The men inside were young, anxious, and untested. The first wave of Marines about to launch the United States' first major ground offensive of World War II. They didn't know it yet, but history was watching. Across the island, Japanese troops waited, hardened by victories in China and the Pacific, confident that no foreign soldier could challenge them in the unforgiving jungle. Yet here, on this forgotten island, the myth of their invincibility would dissolve beneath the weight of hunger, disease, and relentless American grit. In the coming months, the rainforest would become a graveyard of machines, a furnace of courage, and the birthplace of modern jungle warfare. The battle for Guadalcanal would not be decided by strategy alone, but by endurance, spirit, and the will to survive in hell itself. This is not just the story of campaign. It is the story of men who stepped into the unknown and discovered what victory truly costs. The sea was calm, but the men were not. As dawn lifted over Guadalcanal, the distant hum of engines rolled across the waves like a heartbeat of destiny. The Marines clutched their rifles, staring into a horizon of fog and fear. None of them had fought a jungle war before. None knew what waited beyond that green curtain. But behind them loomed the Pacific, endless, cold, and uncaring. Ahead lay the island that would test the courage of nations. What began as a landing would soon become a crucible. Guadalcanal was no longer just a place. It was an awakening. On the morning of August 7th, 1942, America's war in the Pacific changed forever. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandegrift, approached the northern shores of Guadalcanal, an obscure island few had ever heard of before that day. The objective was simple on paper: seize an unfinished Japanese airfield and deny Tokyo control of the Solomon Islands. But in war, simplicity dies with the first shot. The amphibious landing began under the cover of naval bombardment. Battleships thundered as waves of landing craft surged toward the beaches. The men, drenched in sweat and fear, braced for the inevitable storm of bullets. Yet when the ramps dropped, silence answered. The jungle did not roar, it waited. The Japanese garrison on the northern coast had withdrawn inland, stunned by the sudden assault. For the first few hours, the Americans met no resistance. They moved quickly, capturing the nearly completed Lunga airstrip, soon to be renamed Henderson Field. But victory came with unease. The Marines had landed in another world. The Guadalcanal jungle was not a battlefield. It was a living thing, a suffocating, insect-filled labyrinth that swallowed light and sound alike. Vines choked trees thicker than a man's torso. Every step sank into mud. The air hung heavy with rot, and the nights echoed with sounds no one could identify. Within days, boots rotted, weapons jammed, and skin blistered from the humidity. Yet the true enemy had not revealed itself. When the Japanese finally struck, they came like ghosts. On August 21st, at a place the Marines would name the Tenere River, the first great test began. Japanese Colonel Kaineo Ichiki led over 900 elite troops, veterans of earlier conquests, in a banzai charge meant to sweep the Americans into the sea. Screaming war cries shattered the jungle silence. The ground shook beneath their feet, but the Americans were ready. Hidden behind sandbags and barbed wire, the Marines unleashed a storm of machine gun fire and mortar rounds. The night sky erupted in tracers and fire. When dawn came, the river ran red. Of Ichiki's men, only a handful survived. The myth of Japanese invincibility, born in China, feared across the Pacific, began to crumble in the mud of Tenere. For the Marines, the battle was both triumph and horror. Many had never seen such ferocity, the willingness of Japanese soldiers to charge through death itself. The Americans realized that this was not a war of position, but of will. And the jungle, indifferent and cruel, cared nothing for either side. As August faded, so did the illusion of quick victory. The Japanese Navy struck back. On the night of August 8th to 9th, while Marines dug in ashore, Allied cruisers guarding the transport ships were ambushed off Savo Island. In less than an hour, 4 heavy cruisers were sunk, and over 1,000 sailors were lost. When morning came, the Marines awoke to find their naval support and most of their supplies gone. Food dwindled. Ammunition ran low. Malaria spread like wildfire. The Marines called themselves the Cactus Air Force, using the code name for Guadalcanal, as they scraped together makeshift aircraft defenses. Every can of beans, every drop of fuel became precious. Yet morale held. The men learned to adapt, to fight the jungle itself as much as the enemy. When rain turned foxholes into swamps, they dug deeper. When their uniforms rotted, they wrapped themselves in rags. They learned to move silently, to listen for the faint rustle of movement in the trees. Each night, the jungle whispered, and death walked unseen. Meanwhile, Japanese reinforcements slipped ashore under cover of darkness. They called the nightly naval bombardments the Tokyo Express, as destroyers raced down the slot, the narrow waters between islands, to shell American positions. The men learned to dread the night. At Henderson Field, Marines crouched in trenches, counting seconds between the distant whine of incoming shells. Sleep was a luxury few could afford. Still, they endured. Every morning, the battered Cactus Air Force rose into the humid air to meet waves of enemy bombers. With limited fuel and spare parts, pilots fought, landed, and repaired their planes by hand. Mechanics scavenged metal from wrecks, turning broken aircraft into new ones. Against all odds, they held the sky. As the weeks bled into months, Guadalcanal ceased to be a mere operation. It became a symbol. Here, in the mud and misery, the Americans proved that courage was not born of perfection, but persistence. They learned to fight not just the enemy, but fear itself. In the words of one Marine, the jungle didn't care who was brave. It cared who kept moving. By September, both sides understood what Guadalcanal truly was. Not an island to be captured, but a test to be survived. The Japanese Imperial Army, once certain of victory, now faced something they had never encountered before, an enemy who would not break, even when starving, sick, or alone. And as the rains fell and the jungle swallowed the dead, both armies realized the same truth. This was no longer a campaign of strategy or conquest. It was a struggle for existence, fought inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat, in the green hell of Guadalcanal. When the sun set over Guadalcanal, the jungle changed its face. Daylight brought heat, disease, and exhaustion, but night brought terror. The cries of unseen men, the distant rumble of naval guns, and the whisper of movement in the trees haunted every Marine who tried to sleep. Darkness was no ally. It was alive, breathing, watching. For the Japanese, it was the hour of vengeance. For the Americans, it was the hour of endurance. In the blackness between the trees, men began to understand what kind of war they were truly fighting. A war where the night itself was an enemy. By September 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had become something neither side had expected. A slow, grinding contest fought as much in the shadows as in open combat. The Americans held Henderson Field, their fragile lifeline to the outside world. Every crate of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every pound of food that reached the airfield was a victory in itself. Yet even as the Marines dug deeper into their muddy foxholes, the jungle around them whispered with movement. The Japanese called their nighttime reinforcements the Tokyo Express. Sleek destroyers raced down from bases in Rabaul under cover of darkness, unloading fresh troops, food, and artillery before vanishing by dawn. By day, the skies belonged to the Cactus Air Force, but by night, the island belonged to the Japanese. The Marines called it the Night of Hell. On the evening of September 13th, Colonel Kaineo Kawaguchi launched a massive counterattack. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers advanced through dense jungle toward Henderson Field, carrying rifles, bayonets, and an unbreakable belief in victory. The Americans waited in silence, rifles trained on the darkness. Then, from the tree-line, came the screams. Bonsai! The sound tore through the night like lightning. The Japanese came in waves, shouting, charging, some wielding only swords. The Marines held their ground, machine guns spitting fire, mortars lighting up the jungle in flashes of orange. Each attack was beaten back, only for another to follow. By dawn, the ground was carpeted with bodies. Kawaguchi's assault had failed. Over 1,200 Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying in the jungle, their courage unmatched, their sacrifice undeniable. The Marines called the site Edson's Ridge, after Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, whose paratroopers had held the line against impossible odds. It was said that the men didn't fight for strategy that night. They fought for survival and for each other. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The jungle did not forgive. The Marines were exhausted, fevered, and hungry. Malaria struck without mercy. Skin turned pale, eyes hollowed, and even the strongest men trembled. The relentless rain turned trenches into swamps, and the smell of rot filled the air. Every man looked older than his years. The Japanese, too, suffered. Supplies ran thin. The same courage that had fueled their assaults now became a curse. They refused to retreat, refused to surrender. Many starved in the jungle, reduced to eating roots, bark, and insects. They called Guadalcanal the Island of Death. And yet, the fighting did not stop. In the waters off the island, night battles raged, chaotic, brutal clashes lit by the fire of burning ships. On October 11th, at the Battle of Cape Esperance, American cruisers ambushed a Japanese convoy under the cover of darkness. Radar, still a new technology, gave the Americans the edge. When the shooting stopped, for Japanese ships were sinking beneath the waves. But victory was never simple. 2 nights later, Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna returned with vengeance. Their massive guns rained shells on a Henderson field, each explosion a thunderclap that shook the island. The bombardment destroyed dozens of planes, blasted fuel stores, and killed countless men. When morning came, the airfield was a field of craters. And yet it still operated. Within 24 hours, the Cactus Air Force was flying again, patched, rebuilt, and defiant. Mechanics worked bare-chested in the rain, covered in oil and mud. Pilots took off from half-ruined runways, engines sputtering but hearts unbroken. For the Japanese soldiers hiding in the jungle, the sound of American planes returning became a symbol of despair. They realized what the jungle was teaching both armies. Courage alone could not win Guadalcanal. Only endurance, physical, industrial, and spiritual, could. The island became a graveyard of expectations. Japanese commanders sent orders for final attacks, but each one ended the same way. Brave men cut down by firepower they couldn't match in a jungle that swallowed their bodies whole. For every Marine lost, the Americans could send another. For every ship sunk, another was built. For Japan, each loss was irreplaceable. Still, the Japanese refused to abandon the island. They came again in late October, in what became known as the Battle for Henderson Field. Thousands of soldiers advanced through miles of jungle, guided by courage and desperation. When they attacked, they did so with the same ferocity as before, and again, the Marines met them with steel and fire. Machine guns glowed red from heat. Mortar teams fired until their shoulders bled. Men fought hand to hand in the mud, bayonets clashing, the air thick with smoke and screams. The Japanese soldiers did not retreat. They fell where they stood. By the end of October, over 2,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead around Henderson Field. The survivors melted back into the jungle, broken, starving, haunted. For the first time in the war, the Japanese High Command faced the unthinkable defeat. Guadalcanal had become more than a battle. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of their empire. And for the Americans, it was a crucible of transformation. The Marines who had landed months earlier as untested recruits were now veterans, gaunt, hardened, and forever changed. They no longer feared the jungle. They had learned to live inside it, to fight within its suffocating embrace. As November approached, the rains intensified, and both sides braced for what would come next. The Japanese Navy, desperate to turn the tide, prepared one final attempt to retake Guadalcanal. It would be a battle of ships, men, and will, a clash that would determine the fate of the Pacific. The jungle was silent again, but it was only waiting. Because on Guadalcanal, peace was just the pause between storms. The jungle burned, and the ocean answered. By November 1942, Guadalcanal was no longer just a battle on land. It had become a struggle that reached into the very heart of the Pacific. The sea itself turned into a graveyard, where ships clashed in darkness and fire lit the waves like molten glass. The island had drawn both navies into its orbit, each unwilling to let go. For the Japanese, it was a matter of honor. For the Americans, survival. And for the men who fought beneath those burning skies, Guadalcanal became not a place, but a destiny. By the first week of November 1942, Guadalcanal had consumed both armies and both navies. Months of combat had transformed the campaign from a daring landing into a brutal test of endurance. Neither side could supply their troops adequately. Neither could retreat without losing face. The jungle starved the soldiers, but the ocean, the vast, black Pacific, devoured their fleets. The Japanese prepared for one final, decisive effort. Their goal was clear: destroy Henderson Field, land reinforcements, and drive the Americans from the island once and for all. To achieve it, they would send nearly 11 transports, escorted by 2 battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, one of the largest naval forces ever assembled in the South Pacific. The Americans knew it was coming. From their observation posts on the island, they watched the distant flashes of lightning on the horizon. Or perhaps, they thought, the guns of the approaching enemy. They didn't have the strength to stop the Japanese on land, so they prepared to meet them at sea. On the night of November 13th, 1942, the waters north of Guadalcanal erupted. In what became known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, American and Japanese ships collided at point-blank range, so close that the men on deck could see the faces of the enemy illuminated by gunfire. The Japanese battleships Hai and Kirishima opened fire, their 14-inch guns sending shockwaves across the ocean. American destroyers darted between them, launching torpedoes, their crews shouting through smoke and chaos. Searchlights cut through the darkness, revealing carnage on both sides. The sea boiled with fire and steel. For hours, neither side yielded. Ships rammed, exploded, or vanished beneath the waves. The night sky glowed red, a burning reflection of human will and tragedy. When dawn finally came, the Americans had lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. The Japanese battleship Hai was crippled and later sunk. But Henderson Field still stood. The battle was not over. 2 nights later, on November 15th, the Japanese tried again. This time, they sent the battleship Kirishima to finish what Hai had started. Waiting for her was the American battleship USS Washington, commanded by Admiral Willis Lee, a man of calm resolve, standing in the dark bridge of his ship, illuminated only by radar screens. When contact was made, the Washington fired first. Her shells, each weighing over a ton, tore through the night, slamming into the Kirishima with devastating precision. Within minutes, the Japanese ship was ablaze, her turrets twisted, her hull breaking apart. By dawn, she sank beneath the waves, taking hundreds of men with her. The naval battle for Guadalcanal was over, and with it, Japan's last real chance to retake the island. For the Americans onshore, the thunder of the sea battle was more than noise. It was salvation. When they looked up from their foxholes and saw no enemy shells falling, they knew something had changed. The tide had turned. Yet victory brought no celebration. The beaches were littered with wreckage. The air reeked of oil and death. Hundreds of American sailors were gone, swallowed by the same ocean that had delivered them there. In the days that followed, the surviving Marines scavenged what they could from the wrecks that washed ashore. Ration tins, ammunition boxes, sometimes even letters from home, their words blurred by salt water. For a few quiet hours, the island seemed to mourn with them. But Guadalcanal had no mercy. The jungle still buzzed with insects, the sun still beat down like a hammer, and the Japanese still fought on in pockets across the island. Thousands remained, starving, diseased, but unyielding. They refused to surrender. They refused even to speak of defeat. At night, the men on both sides stared into the darkness, thinking of home. For the Americans, it was a promise, a light that kept them alive. For the Japanese, it was a memory they would never see again. By December, the balance was clear. The Japanese Navy could no longer protect its transports. The airfield was firmly in American hands, its planes now striking deep into enemy territory. The once proud Imperial fleet that had roamed the Pacific freely was now bleeding, forced into retreat. Still, even as the Japanese command began planning withdrawal, their soldiers on the ground fought to the last breath. Many did not know that Tokyo had already decided to abandon Guadalcanal. They kept fighting, kept dying for an island that their leaders had already given up. And so, the sea around Guadalcanal, that restless, endless sea, became a symbol. For Japan, it marked the beginning of the end. For America, it was the dawn of a new confidence, proof that they could stand against the empire that had once seemed unstoppable. But for the men who lived through it, the sea was something else entirely. It was where their friends vanished, where courage and fear became one, where history was written in smoke and blood. The Battle of Guadalcanal was more than a military turning point. It was a human one. The ocean that once divided nations had become the proving ground of a generation. And as the waves rolled quietly over the wrecks, the island behind them continued to burn, a reminder that the true fight, the one for the heart of the jungle, was not yet over. The guns had fallen silent, but the war did not end. After months of blood and fire, the island itself became the enemy. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion stalked every step. Men no longer counted days, only nights survived. The jungle whispered like a graveyard, and every rustle of leaves could mean death. Both armies were trapped, not by each other, but by Guadalcanal itself, a place that demanded everything and gave nothing back. Victory was no longer measured in ground gained, but in heartbeats endured. By December 1942, Guadalcanal had devoured the strength of empires. The great fleets that once ruled the Pacific had withdrawn, leaving behind only the ghosts of ships rusting beneath the waves. The men who remained on the island, American and Japanese alike, lived in a world stripped bare of comfort, color, and mercy. The Americans held Henderson Field, but barely. Supplies trickled in through the rain-soaked beaches, guarded by weary Marines whose eyes no longer shone with youth. Their uniforms were tattered, their faces hollow from hunger and malaria. Rations had run so thin that men boiled captured rice mixed with rainwater or scraped mold from biscuit tins. Every day felt like a small eternity. Yet compared to the Japanese, the Americans lived in relative paradise. For the Imperial troops still hiding in the jungle, starvation was absolute. Their supply lines had collapsed. Every night, the Tokyo Express tried to deliver food by fast destroyer, but most crates were dropped miles offshore or destroyed before reaching land. Desperate soldiers waded into the surf under moonlight, trying to recover floating sacks of rice. Many drowned in the attempt. Others fought each other for scraps, tearing open boxes filled not with food, but with ammunition. They began to call Guadalcanal Starvation Island. In the dense interior, Japanese soldiers dug shallow shelters and waited for death. Some were found later with rifles still in hand, bodies thin as skeletons. Many died not from bullets, but from dysentery, fever, and the endless, consuming hunger. Even so, the Japanese spirit did not break easily. Patrols still struck from the shadows, ambushing Marine outposts and vanishing into the jungle. Every step outside the perimeter was a gamble. Snipers hid in the trees. Mines and tripwires littered the trails. For the Americans, no place felt safe, not even sleep. It was a different kind of war now. Not grand assaults or naval battles, but survival. Marines learned to fight the jungle itself. They slept in mud, fought off swarms of mosquitoes, and rationed every drop of quinine to stave off malaria. Some men hallucinated, seeing faces in the mist, hearing voices that weren't there. Others simply stopped talking altogether. The medical tents were full, but medicine was scarce. Men burned with fever while corpsmen read them letters from home, voices trembling as they pretended everything would be fine. In those long, stifling nights, courage became quieter, not a roar, but a whisper of endurance. Back in Tokyo, the Japanese high command faced a bitter truth. Their empire could no longer sustain the losses. Guadalcanal had drained their fuel, their ships, and their will. The emperor's generals debated whether honor meant continuing the fight or saving what little remained of their army. In January 1943, the decision came: evacuation. Operation Coup, they called it, a withdrawal disguised as a final offensive. Thousands of Japanese soldiers would be rescued under the cover of darkness, slipping past American patrols and aircraft. For the Americans, the news came slowly. They didn't know the enemy was leaving. They thought the silence was a trap. For weeks, patrols combed the jungle, finding only abandoned camps, skeletons, and the hollow remnants of what had once been an invincible army. When they finally realized the Japanese were gone, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like relief, heavy, quiet, and unreal. The final numbers told their own story. Over 7,000 Americans had been killed, wounded, or missing. More than 30,000 Japanese soldiers had perished, many from disease or starvation. And yet, what lingered most was not triumph, but the memory of what they had endured. Those who survived Guadalcanal carried it for the rest of their lives. The smell of rain on jungle leaves, the buzzing of flies around forgotten graves, the endless mud that pulled at their boots and soles alike. For them, victory was not glorious. It was something darker, quieter, and more sacred. Historians would later say that Guadalcanal marked the turning point of the Pacific War. From that island of misery, the tide began to turn. Japan's expansion stopped. America's advance began. But for the men who fought there, such words fell hollow. They hadn't fought for strategy or empire. They had fought to see the next sunrise. When reinforcements finally arrived, replacing the exhausted Marines, many of the veterans wept, not from joy, but from disbelief that it was truly over. They watched new men step onto the same cursed beaches, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet. The battle had ended, but Guadalcanal had changed them forever. The Americans learned resilience in its rawest form. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. The Japanese learned tragedy, that honor without mercy leads only to ruin. And the world learned that even in the darkest jungles, human endurance could outlast the impossible. As the rains finally began to ease, the island grew quiet again. The trees stood motionless, hiding the scars of war beneath new green leaves. The beaches shimmered under sunlight, as if pretending nothing had happened. But beneath the soil, history slept, the story of men who had faced nature, the enemy, and themselves and endured. The battle was over, but its echoes would never fade. Guadalcanal was no longer just a name. It had become a legend carved into the heart of a generation. The jungle that had once devoured men now stood silent, haunted by their memory. From the ashes of fear rose a new sense of belief, that even in the darkest corners of the world, the human spirit could endure the unimaginable. The men who left Guadalcanal did not walk away as heroes. They walked away as survivors, and their story would change the course of the Pacific forever. When the guns fell silent over Guadalcanal in February 1943, a strange quiet descended upon the island. The air no longer vibrated with artillery or the drone of planes. Instead, it carried the soft rustle of wind through the palm trees, the sound of an island trying to heal. For the first time in 6 months, the men could breathe without expecting death at any moment. But peace felt foreign, almost unreal. The Marines who had endured the long nightmare of Guadalcanal looked around at what remained. A landscape torn apart, littered with rusting helmets, sunken tanks, and the ghosts of both armies. What had begun as an obscure campaign had turned into one of the most decisive victories in modern history. Guadalcanal marked the first major offensive victory for the Allies against Japan, a moment when the myth of Japanese invincibility was finally shattered. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese Empire had seemed unstoppable, stretching from the shores of China to the jungles of Burma, from the Philippines to New Guinea. Every battle had been swift, merciless, and absolute. But here, on this forgotten island, that empire had met something it had never faced before, an enemy that refused to yield. The cost was immense. Thousands of lives were lost on both sides. Entire fleets were crippled, cities back home mourned, and families waited for letters that would never come. Yet, through the mud and misery, Guadalcanal gave the world something far greater than victory. It gave it hope. For the United States, Guadalcanal was a proving ground. The Marines who fought there were not professional veterans at the start. They were ordinary young men, many fresh from training, untested and unsure. But through 6 months of hell, they learned what it meant to endure. They fought hunger, disease, and fear as much as bullets. They learned to trust each other more than they trusted fate. And in doing so, they forged the identity that would define the U.S. Marine Corps for generations to come. The phrase "first to fight" became more than a slogan. It became a legacy born in the jungles of Guadalcanal. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal was something else entirely, a turning point wrapped in tragedy. Their commanders had believed that willpower alone could overcome any obstacle. But on Guadalcanal, they faced an enemy who fought with equal determination, backed by endless resources and growing momentum. The loss forced Japan to confront the reality that courage, no matter how fierce, could not sustain an empire built on overextension and pride. Many Japanese survivors of the island returned home silent, carrying the weight of defeat that their society struggled to acknowledge. They had fought bravely, honorably, but in a war that no longer made sense. Strategically, Guadalcanal changed everything. The victory allowed the Allies to seize control of the Solomon Islands, cutting Japan's communication lines and paving the way for the island-hopping campaigns that would follow: New Georgia, Bougainville, the Gilbert Islands, and beyond. From Guadalcanal, the road to Tokyo began. But beyond strategy and maps, the true impact of Guadalcanal lived in the hearts of those who survived it. When the veterans returned home, many found it hard to speak of what they had seen. How do you describe nights filled with screams from the jungle? How do you explain watching friends vanish into the sea? For them, the war never fully ended. It lived in dreams, in memories, in the sudden silence of a rainy night. And yet, out of their silence came resilience. The men who endured Guadalcanal carried with them a quiet strength that helped build the world that followed. They knew the value of endurance, of unity, of life itself. The island they left behind became sacred ground. Nature slowly reclaimed it. Vines crawled over rusted guns, trees grew through wrecked plains, and coral swallowed the ships that once rained death. Time, patient and merciful, began to erase the scars. But beneath that green surface, the soil still remembers. Every raindrop that falls on Guadalcanal carries a whisper of history, the courage, the suffering, and the endurance of those who fought there. In Washington, President Roosevelt called the victory a bright dawn after a long night. In Tokyo, silence filled the halls of command. Around the world, newspapers printed the same truth: the tide had turned. But for the men who had lived it, dawn was not bright. It was gray, quiet, and heavy with the weight of what it cost. They had not fought for glory, but for survival. They had not sought fame, but peace. And in that humility lay their greatness. Guadalcanal was not just the end of Japan's advance. It was the beginning of America's ascent. It was the point where despair became determination, where fear turned into faith. From this island of mud and rain grew the confidence that would carry the Allies across the Pacific, through Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, all the way to victory. The world often remembers wars through dates and battles, But the true story of Guadalcanal lives in the hearts that refuse to break. It was there that ordinary men discovered what history would later call extraordinary. The echoes of their footsteps still linger beneath the trees, carried by the wind, reminding us that courage is not loud and heroism is not clean. Sometimes it's just the will to take one more step, even when everything inside you says you cannot. History remembers the victors, but the jungle remembers the fallen. Long after the guns fell silent, Guadalcanal remained a place where the earth still whispered their names. Beneath the palms and vines lie the echoes of courage, fear, and endurance, the fragments of a generation who faced the impossible. The story of Guadalcanal is not merely about war. It is about what war reveals, the strength to fight, the pain to endure, and the hope to rebuild. From that distant island rose a legacy that still shapes the spirit of freedom today. In the decades that followed, Guadalcanal transformed from a battlefield into a memory. Nature reclaimed the scars of war. Vines wound around rusting artillery. Palm trees grew through forgotten bunkers, and coral quietly swallowed the wrecks that once dominated the sea. But though time covered the wounds, it never erased them. Every raindrop that falls upon Guadalcanal still carries a memory of sacrifice, of loss, and of unbreakable will. For those who once walked its jungles, the island never truly let them go. Many who returned home spoke little of it. Some could not bear to. They carried the jungle within them, its heat, its noise, its ghosts. But even in silence, they passed down something greater. The lesson that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to endure it. Guadalcanal changed everything. It changed how the world saw war and how nations understood victory. It marked the first time the United States had stopped the tide of Imperial Japan, not with overwhelming technology, but with sheer endurance. The victory proved that democracy, resilience, and unity could overcome even the most disciplined and determined enemy. It was not a triumph of power. It was a triumph of spirit. The campaign also reshaped modern warfare itself. In the dense jungles of the Solomon Islands, strategies forged in Europe proved useless. The Marines learned to fight a new kind of war, one where terrain was the enemy, where disease could kill faster than bullets, where every rustle of leaves could mean death. Jungle warfare became an art born from necessity, one that would guide every battle that followed, from New Guinea to Vietnam. But beneath tactics and history books lies the human story, the one that can never be fully written. It is the story of the Marine holding his friend's hand in the dark, of the Japanese soldier writing his final letter home beneath a fading moon, of men who once believed themselves enemies but shared the same fear, the same hunger, the same will to live. On both sides, they fought for something greater than themselves, for duty, for honor, for survival. And in that shared humanity lies the true legacy of Guadalcanal. As the years passed, the island became quiet again. The airfields grew over, the foxholes filled with rain, and the jungle reclaimed what had once been torn apart. But history is not silent there. Beneath the canopy, among the vines, the land still holds their echoes. The rusted shells and dog tags scattered through the soil are not relics of destruction. They are reminders of endurance. When veterans returned years later, many wept, not for victory, but for memory. They remembered the faces of those who did not return, the young, the brave, the ordinary men who never saw the world beyond that island. For them, Guadalcanal was not a symbol of triumph. It was sacred ground. To the world, Guadalcanal was a turning point in World War II. To those who survived it, it was the moment they discovered who they truly were. The Japanese who fought there, too, carried the memory with quiet reverence. Many spoke not of defeat, but of respect for an enemy who had fought with honor and strength. For them, Guadalcanal became a lesson in humility, in the limits of human endurance, and in the futility of pride. And so, in the years that followed, the island became not a battlefield, but a bridge. A place where former enemies could meet, shake hands, and understand that they had shared something sacred, the price of survival. Today, the name Guadalcanal stands not for destruction, but for transformation. It reminds us that courage is not born in comfort, but in struggle. That true strength lies not in domination, but in perseverance. And that peace, real peace, is not the absence of war, but the understanding born from its pain. Every generation since has inherited that lesson. Every soldier who steps into the unknown carries a part of Guadalcanal with him. The belief that even in the darkest places, humanity endures. For those who listen closely, the jungle still speaks. It speaks of fire and thunder, of fear and faith, of men who gave everything they had so that others might live free. Its voice is soft now, a whisper among the leaves, a hum in the air, but its message endures. Remember us. Remember what we endured. Remember what it cost. Guadalcanal was not just an island. It was a crucible, a place where a generation was tested, where myths were shattered, and where hope was reborn. It was where America learned that victory was not about power, but persistence, and where Japan learned that even courage has its limits when faced with endless determination. The world that rose from Guadalcanal was forever changed. The tides of war turned, the balance shifted, and the march toward peace began. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military at all. It was moral. The belief that even in the face of chaos, humanity can endure. 80 years have passed, yet the lessons of Guadalcanal remain eternal. In every jungle of conflict, in every struggle against impossible odds, the spirit of those who fought their lives on, their courage, their endurance, their sacrifice, they're not just stories of the past. They are warnings and inspirations for the future. Remember them, not as soldiers or enemies, but as human beings who prove that willpower can shape history. The jungle may have consumed their bodies, but it could never silence their legacy. Because every time the wind moves through the palms of Guadalcanal, it carries a message for us all. Endure, believe, and never forget what it took to be free.